Hello and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's third and final National Missing Persons Hackathon webinar. The hackathon being delivered to you in partnership with AusCyber, Australian Federal Police, the National Missing Persons Coordination Centre and Trace Labs. By my count, for those that aren't actually looking at the days, we are exactly 7 days away from the commencement of the hackathon. Our live stream will be starting at 10 a.m. next Thursday, and it will be broadcast to the public. So not only will the participants and the volunteers have the opportunity to view the session, we will be providing this to the audience as well, where we will have an opportunity to see what 650 participants are going to be doing during the National Missing Persons Hackathon, and what 150 of our judges and even more volunteers will be doing in support of the National Missing Persons Hackathon. This webinar has been proudly presented by one of our national sponsors, Secure Code Warrior, an Australian-based cybersecurity company that is helping develop secure code from the beginning. So thank you to Secure Code Warrior and to all of our sponsors of the National Missing Persons Hackathon for 2020. Well, today, we're delving into OSINT and cybersecurity again. This time we're putting a bit of a twist on it. We're going to be talking to our US counterparts, experts in cybersecurity, in industrial control systems, OSINT, penetration testing, and also those that are actually using this information to locate and protect children. I have the absolute privilege to introduce you to our panelists today. Our first panelist is the CEO of Shadow Dragon, Daniel Clemens. Hello, Daniel, and welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is the Chief of Staff for Scythe. An absolute pleasure to have her with us, Elizabeth Wharton. Hello, Liz.
Hello. I feel so naked without a beard. I mean, I just couldn't get one as fabulous in time.
But look at that great mic you've got. Like, you're beating us on that. I mean,
Daniel, I think you and I didn't bring the mics like these two did. That's for sure.
yeah, I know. I have a really cool mic at the office, but then I was like, ended up doing the home thing. So,
well, we're already having a little bit of a beard off and a mic off between. That's fabulous. Speaking of panelists, the next person I would like to introduce to you is the CEO and founder of the National Child Protection Task Force, Kevin Metcalf. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Hello.
Fabulous to have you with us. And last, but definitely not least in any way, is Robert M. Lee, the CEO of Dragos Inc. Hello, Robert. How are you?
Yeah, doing very well. Thank you for having me.
It is an absolute pleasure to have the four of you with us. Now, I know that you are doing this in your own time. We are actually in the future for you. You're yesterday, 7 p.m. So that's a little bit exciting for us that we are ahead of you. And hopefully through our discussions today, we may cement the fact that Australia may be ahead of the USA in a few other areas, but I'll just leave that there for us to ponder. Look, just a reminder to our audience, please feel free to engage with us. You've got a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to use that and ask questions of our panelists. We will try and get through as many as we can. And also this session is being recorded as well if you would like to review it a little bit later on. Now, we only have an hour, so we want to try and jam-pack as much as we can in discussing OSINT and cybersecurity with these fabulous panelists. So I'm going to ask the first question just to give our audience an insight into who you are, who you work for, and give us a little bit of an idea as to how you entered cybersecurity. So Daniel, I'd love for you to start first.
okay. So I started in cybersecurity probably around 1997, 1998. And I had kind of, well, a little bit before that, I was probably about 15, and I had gotten into a few car wrecks, and because I was young and a bad driver, probably irresponsible, and I decided, you know what, it's probably smarter for me to get into computers, and I really liked it, and so I traded some baseball cards and had a job and saved up all my money and got a computer. And then about 2 years later, I had moved to Durango, Colorado, and there was an ISP there. I went in and just basically said, hey, you know, I'd love to be on the technical support staff. This looks cool. And they had a job opening that I didn't know about, and they interviewed me. About 2 days later, I had a job, and from that point, you know, like the whole for what I was exposed to, the internet security scene was kind of starting, and I'd moved out that year in high school and had an apartment with this other guy who was really good exploit developer. And this is kind of before FRAC came out. And so I got exposed to a lot of interesting stuff at a very early age. And so that's really kind of where I got, you know, introduced to things. I was doing the, you know, technical support for a large dial-up ISP. There's about 30,000 users. And, you know, I was striving to be the sysadmin because that was the coolest next step, you know, and we'd have big arguments over what was cool and why we shouldn't move to loadable kernel modules and we should stay monolithic. And, you know, that was kind of where I started, you know.
Fabulous. Excellent. Daniel, you mentioned the date of when you got your first computer. And I've got to say, I was just thinking about when I received my first computer, and that was in 1993. And I think it was either IBM or an Acer, obviously one of those boxy desktops. Elizabeth, can I throw to you in regards to your background, and perhaps do you remember when you got your first computer?
Oh gosh, my first computer I bought for I remember how much I worked multiple jobs over the summer in college to be able to not have to go to the computer lab.
Oh,
But yeah, so I fell into it backwards. I'm a lawyer by training. I've worked in public policy and I guess knew the wrong people, but was in Atlanta, and once some of my brother's friends who would go to the 2600 meetings, I mean, I didn't know that I was cool. My grandfather taught me how to write BASIC on a Commodore 64, you know, like in his fallout shelter basement, but they just started asking questions of, oh, you're a lawyer. Well, what if I did this? Or what if I did that? And eventually I started putting a kind of the side advice into practice and working with specifically on the public policy side is working with state, local, and federal government on, hey, there's a easier, better way to do this. You don't have to be a tech expert. Let me connect you to my clients, or let me get these researchers in front of you to help explain. So it's kind of, I approach things from the non-technical background, but I don't know if this is a good time to kind of tease out when it comes to the OSINT side. I was doing OSINT before I knew I was doing OSINT. As lawyers, you don't want to walk into a meeting or a deal kind of blind. And particularly my colleagues did a lot of litigation. And, you know, if somebody is filing a claim saying that they're injured at work, or, you know, oh, this thing never happened. And when you can go and a quick search online and say, oh, well, okay, your Facebook pictures indicate you were water skiing this past weekend. And gosh, that's awfully odd considering you claimed you were in so much pain that you could barely walk and certainly couldn't work. But I mean, hey, it is what it is. Between that and even just on the recruiting side, working and trying to explain to candidates if we are hiring them to work in a law firm that, you know, hey, perhaps we should lock down some of your social media. Like,
Yeah.
do those things you do, take those pictures, that's fine. But if we're trying to convince someone that you are a world-renowned expert on something, perhaps we shouldn't find you tailgating and partying with your, but it kind of diminishes. So yeah, I mean, that's the long and short of it. And Scythe does all kinds of things that I'm happy to talk about later. But yeah, that's kind of my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Look, that's a great insight, Liz. Thank you very much. And yes, a lot of the examples that you've provided are the things that we've been talking about over the last couple of webinars, and I'm sure that will continue on today. So thank you for that, Liz. Kevin, just before I move on to you, team, can I ask you to pop up the first poll question for us, please? And as they do that, Kevin, can I throw to you and give us an insight into the work of NCTPF and how you came to be where you are?
Yes, obviously, as you can tell by my beard, unlike Robert and Daniel's, it's all gray. So I've been around a long time, started in '88, either working in military or law enforcement. So I worked state and local up through federal. So I was working federal counterterrorism up until, say, about 2007. Around that time, I was working counterterrorism, so I was out of the country a lot. And at that time, I was the only parent, single parent. I had my two little girls by myself up until I think about 7 years ago. I should probably know that date better. My wife is right over here, but up until about 7 years ago, since they were 2 and 5, so I had really small kids. And at that time, I had about 21 or 22 years in. So I thought, I think I'll go to law school. So quit federal law enforcement, came back to law school with the intent of going back to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where I had some connections. And that, for the first time in their lives, my girls were pretty settled. So I just stayed where I was at and started working for the state of Arkansas as a state prosecutor. I soon got bored, and that's something I do a lot. So I got bored and I started teaching cell phone investigations around the country. That was probably several years ago. And each time I would go somewhere and teach, I would always say, if you need any help, let me know. If you need to go over this, just call me. So that turned into a lot of calls and a lot of referrals, from other people. And the way you get really good at something is, you do it over and over and over again. So I really had no interest in prosecuting these tech cases, but I noticed there were a lot of prosecutors that were afraid of social media. They were afraid of electronic evidence. There's a lot of unknowns there and uncertainties, and then trying to explain to a jury and trying to explain to a judge. Well, I found that even with all my background in investigations, when I was standing in front of a jury, I had to make everything fit, to make sense, to tell the story, and that story has to connect all these things, all these parts: social media, the cell phone records, the witness statement. All this stuff has to flow. If not, you're going to get attacked from the defense because you got a problem in your case. So the more I did that, and I've had several jury trials involving mobile devices, cellular, electronic evidence, I started wondering, why aren't we doing this on the front end? Law enforcement is really siloed. All the data is just stuck together. I do cell phone stuff. I do call detail records. That person works with IP. That person works with something else. And so I took this concept back, and I actually, as a prosecutor, started jumping in on cases and started working with the investigators, and we started getting some really good results. So a few years ago, I was involved in the recovery of a few teens that were taken by online sexual predators. And that really just kind of blew everything up. And then I started being asked to go speak at different conferences. And at one conference, I met Kevin Branzetti. Daniel knows Kevin very well, but met Kevin and we started collaborating. Kevin's world was counterterrorism. He's there, NYPD, and now the Manhattan DA's office. So we started collaborating on things and started bringing people in to cover things. We started working missing, exploited, and trafficked children quite heavily. And this all kind of culminated recently with us pulling 100 investigators together from the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So we had 100 investigators from those 5 countries, often referred to as the 5 Eyes. And we had vendors, including Daniel was great enough to put some of his tools out to this group. And we had some really, really good results. Trace Labs, Adrian and James, they were involved in this as well. We hit this pretty hard, and it actually went over several weeks, but we really culminated at the end of September. So I think, when you're talking about this Australia versus US thing, to me, I work very closely with Australian law enforcement. So it's much more of a collaborative. What can we learn from each other? How can we improve each other? To me, that's always the goal. And that's kind of what I do. There's a term now that's called being Metcalfed. That means that you're, sucked into this thing, and you're never going to escape, and you're going to put all your resources and time into finding missing kids. But I know I got to rambling there, so I'll hand it back to you.
No, definitely not rambling, Kevin. And yes, look, and it's great to see that, we can actually collaborate across continents, across countries, and across, several jurisdictions as well within each country to be able to do some social good for a really worthy cause. So yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. Robert, I'll throw over to you in regards to giving our audience an insight. And just as you do that, can I ask the team to throw up the results of our first poll question? Thanks, Robert.
Perfect. Yes. So I started out more on the control system side than the cybersecurity side, but I was not an engineer or anything by trade. But I was in the Air Force, and I got my start really doing humanitarian missions down in like Cameroon and similar, building wind turbines and water filtration units and similar. Really, really enjoyed what control systems could do for modern life. So I wanted to transition over to Africa Command at the time to do more of that. But they had this new schoolhouse they were building in the Air Force at the time, the Cyber Warfare Operations Schoolhouse. And they asked me, you want to go be a pilot? My parents are enlisted, so I said no. I generally don't like the pilots. I'd rather go do cyber if that gets me back to Africa Command. But once I got into it, I started experiencing a lot of what sort of the adversaries out there would do. I took a certain sense of personal offense to the fact that people would be targeting industrial control systems. I don't really mind if China breaks into the US or vice versa, or similar, to steal personal records and doing intelligence operations. That's actually pretty okay in my book between states. But you start targeting civilian infrastructure and going after people and civilians, that really pissed me off to a certain degree. So I started getting more and more involved in that. I went over and joined the intelligence community. Did time doing counterterrorism ops and classic intelligence kind of surveillance mission sets. Then started blending the cyber and intel piece together. I got picked up for the National Security Agency and ended up doing an ICS focus mission set, or industrial control system focus mission set, and really took a lot of the stuff we were doing in counterterrorism on like victim centric, target analysis and similar, and putting a focus on, okay, well, what does that really mean for going after industrial control systems? What sites would be targeted? What type of adversaries would be going after them? Let's use these as hunting grounds, if you will. And really my mission set was go find the unknown unknowns, like go find the adversaries we're not tracking. And what we found was those that were targeting control system environments were not only different actors in general, states we typically weren't familiar with, but even in the existing states of our typical adversaries, there would be completely different groups doing completely different tradecraft and methods. So it was really just an interesting thing to explore. And a lot of the cybersecurity components of industrial control systems really after the fact, where what I mean by that is not bolted on after, but more the fact that the mission is really the physics of the environment and the physical process. So a lot of these cybersecurity best practices don't really work on the operations side, or at least have the same efficacy. So you'll see folks come in and kind of copy and paste IT security practices into OT or operations technology, and it just will not work. And that presents a really cool opportunity to kind of teach people and train and do something different. And then lastly, they put me on the offense, going after other people's industrial control environments when I was in the government. That's probably when I started getting pretty heavily into OSINT. Obviously, when you're starting to profile where to go and where to target, I think a lot of people like to believe that your state adversaries are doing all the coolest possible things. But Usually when I see a really, really cool exploit or whatever else, I usually think some government contractor just advertising their wares. Most of the coolest things we did were as basic as possible, because there's no bonus points for looking good in the Kaspersky report. So we did it as good as we could, which was the basics. It was fun, but I did not like targeting other people's infrastructure. It's kind of the whole reason I joined, was to stop those people. So I jumped out, created Dragos. We're an industrial specific cybersecurity firm. And really the whole pitch for us is that we're, trying to stand in between people that are trying to hurt others. So it's different than a lot of what's being talked about today, but there's a lot of similarities I think, in the passion that you'll find on the panelist of protecting people. And that makes it a little bit different than protecting data and otherwise, though that's very important as well.
No, definitely. And I think cyber or cybersecurity in general, there's so many layers to it. And, talking about the collaborative environment, I think part of that forms cybersecurity as well. Everyone has their own part to play, ensuring that people are cyber aware and that they are cyber secure, dependent, and it doesn't matter what your background is or what you're actually contributing to it. But you've actually answered part of a question that I wanted to ask you in regards to control systems as to what are some of the challenges that you're seeing in being able to create a secure control system, considering we are so interconnected and, in the Internet of Things era?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in a broad oversimplification, everything that is in IT is also in OT, but we also have physics. And that physics piece makes it very different. Again, the way you're going to approach it, which also means the things the adversary has to do, which largely makes these environments very defensible. The adversary can't just pop in, throw an exploit, and cause a power outage. It's not how it works. They got to learn the engineering and the understanding of the system itself. But again, in a broad oversimplification, I would say a lot of cybersecurity for the enterprise tends to be data security or system security. Again, simplification, but largely, let me protect the system. I don't want to get an adversary that gets root on the system and then does something, or I don't want my data to get stolen. But a lot of industrial security is systems of system security, and it's a focus on what can happen and what's the consequence in those environments. And trying to make sure that a certain pressure relief valve isn't tripped, or a safety system isn't compromised that causes a plant outage. And that's just a different way to think about it. And I would say some of the challenges we're facing, sure, there's technical challenges, but not to be too cliche, the challenges I see most are definitely cultural, and definitely trying to make sure that people want to go over and actually learn that mission set. It's very easy as a cybersecurity professional who is usually not well resourced on the enterprise side either. It's not like you've got so many people and resources and training. It's not like you're just having a great time. And then you get told to go pick up this whole other mission set, which is on the operations side. You may not be given many, if any, resources in addition to that. It's really compelling to bring the cybersecurity playbook, the compliance, the check sheet, whatever you're doing on the enterprise, and just bring it over. And you really got to push against that. And I see to some extent, and maybe this is it's probably not meant to be inflammatory, but I spend a lot of my time these days on the CEO side convincing people it needs to be done in the first place, which is hopefully we could be a bit beyond that. And what I mean by that is people would love to take OT and just have it be IoT, or just have it be a subset of the enterprise. And the reality is it's not. I mean, if you I talk to a lot of CEOs these days of major industrial companies, and they're not in the business of sending emails. They're not in the business of domain controllers. They're in the business of producing oil and gas and mining and water and electricity. And so what they care about most is on the operations side. And if you tell your CEO that you're spending 5 times the amount on your website security than you are your gas turbine security, they're going to lose it. So the reality is OT security is not only worth doing, but it's doable. It's different than IT, but it is a cultural problem for sure sometimes. And it's also really, really important to make sure it is its own thing. There's a lot of difference between Alexa and a gas turbine.
And just a follow-up question in relation to that, and particularly the environment that we've just been under and are still going through with the health pandemic. I remember seeing this meme a little while ago in regards to cybersecurity as to, where cybersecurity or your cybersecurity framework has come from and being implemented. Did it actually come from your CEO? Did it come from your board? Did it come from your CISO? Or did it come from COVID-19? Have you seen a difference over the last last 6 to 7 months in the States in regards to people responding to having to move to online practices or needing mobility?
Yeah, there's been long-standing myths in the industrial community that in the security community we know are silly, but are far pervasive outside the security community, such as the air gap or the segmented plant or things like that. And boards and their CEOs and executive staff were told, we don't need to be doing security in the plant. It's not even online. It's not connected. You got to go through the enterprise to get there anyways. Don't worry about it. And when COVID happened and we started doing remote workforce and we started doing, remote connections in the plants and people were at home and still operating the plant, all the CEOs are looking around going, well, we were lied to. And so it was very obvious in that moment that connectivity has already come to those sites. And so what we saw was a prioritization of industrial security going, oh my gosh, we've not been doing a lot on that side of the house. And it turns out we're hyper-connected. And a lot of these companies are going down some form of a digital transformation journey. It sounds like a buzzword, but it's happening firsthand. A lot of these companies where they are transforming their business operations and taking advantage of like cloud analytics and things they haven't done before. And as they're doing that, they realize they don't have the secure foundation to even go down that journey. COVID really just exacerbated that, where they had all the risk of the transformation without any of the benefits. So yes, we've seen definitely a different dialogue around it. I've seen definitely a different motivation to get it done. And also, I want to say, even having dealt with some of the worst people in the world, as folks on this call have as well, especially when you're talking counterterrorism, there's some pretty awful people, but you still want to believe that the adversary, they're just doing their job. They're like, it's part of the game. But when we started seeing state actors target pharmaceutical companies that were producing the vaccine, not for stealing the vaccine, which would actually make sense as an intelligence requirement, but for potential disruption or modification and just to hurt people, you realize there are just some evil people in the world, and you do need to be the people that stand in the way of that.
No, that's right. Yeah, great point, Robert, on that. Liz, penetration testing, which is what OSINT is known for. When we talk about penetration testing, most people think of red and blue teams, but you actually have a purple team framework. Can you give us an insight into how that works and what, if any, challenges you may have found over the last 12 months, but including the pandemic that we've been going through?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that people tend to overlook, or when you talk about crafting a security environment for your company, your products, is that at the end of the day, everyone's has the same goal, same mission, be it the red team that has been engaged either internally or externally to test the security system, to test the product. And then you have the blue team, the in-house team that is protecting those. And we found that there was this big disconnect of and even going back when I was a senior assistant city attorney for Atlanta, and we would have these, we would engage companies to come in and provide a red team report. And so they would do their testing and they would come back a couple months later with this beautiful report, and it would tell us all kinds of things. But in that gap from the time they did their testing to the time they presented the report, these holes that they had identified were still there and were still wide open, that by the time they explained it to our blue team, that the blue team is then scrambling to say, okay, well, what about these follow-up questions? And they're like, oh, report's done. We're off on our merry way. So Scythe, and it's a community resource. So please, we offer the actual framework that we've put together as a baseline on our website. Download it for free, improve it, do with it what you will. But we said that shouldn't happen. That taking the purple team concept, where as the red team is engaging and conducting their testing, what about if you're sitting almost in the same room as the blue team? What about if you're providing that, feedback of walking them through, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we're seeing. These are some ways, and having almost that real-time feedback and development. So you're strengthening the conversation of, oh, okay, we didn't think you could do that, but what about if you do this? So that our CTO, George, put together the framework with some other community members, and has also built out some workshops that offer for free. There's also several SANS courses, and shameless plug. Sorry, this is what happens when you ask, and I am trying to, we are one of the organizers. There's several different folks who are coming together to put together a Purple Team Summit. So that'll be happening in November. It's free because, again, the same goal is how can we help companies strengthen their systems? And because, as Robert was talking about, as you're watching threat actors, as you're, sometimes, just the accident, like not necessarily looking to cause just chaos, but to get the data, as you're watching all that happen, we all have, like, let's protect it. Let's make it more challenging for them. Let's actually make them earn their keep. And so those are some of the approaches, but also the resources that we've tried to make available, because originally, as you said, we're an adversary threat emulation platform, but that only gets you so far. So that's one of the things we're doing.
Fabulous, excellent. Thanks for giving some insight into how the Scythe Purple Team framework works, and the fact that you've actually opened it up to the community as well, out to the public, says a lot in regards to the value and the mission of Scythe as well. So let's just move over onto the OSINT side of the house, and Kevin, if I can ask you. There's so much information out there that's freely available. And one of the challenges that we know in OSINT is actually the accuracy and the veracity of that information. So you mentioned to us before, you've got a team of 100 investigators that assist you with your cases and with your investigations. How do you and your team confirm that information is actually accurate and that it's not part of a possible, disinformation campaign or other?
That is, well, first of all, I'm a prosecutor. We work with law enforcement agencies. We work quite a bit with Task Force Argos there in Australia, an outstanding group, very aggressive on tracking down these predators and recovering kids. For us, OSINT is often a gap filler or a way. Well, look at the way Trace Labs does the CTF or the search party event. They don't give you a lot of starting points. Like, here's a name, here's the information, the missing poster, or go. And you have to have a starting point. Sometimes that, if we have a very common name, that can definitely be problematic. I'm working we've got an operation going right now where I just ran a person's name and I came up with two pretty good possibilities. Now, I can't take action on either one of those based on just that. So for me, OSINT is a gap filler, but it's always got to be layered data. We have the luxury of going into the legal side. I can write a subpoena. I can get a search warrant signed by a judge here that can dig deeper. But in order to dig deeper, I've got to be able to justify that. I've got to be able to say, this is the person, or this is the device that was involved in that crime, and here's why. Here's how I know. So there is a ton of data out here, and I know the breach data issue that's been a big controversy depending on where you stand on it. If I find an IP address and I run that through breach data, and I get a hit, this person has used this IP address before. Well, maybe that's good. It depends on the case. As a prosecutor or an investigator, I can't use that. I can't depend on that. What I can depend on, though, if I get that IP address from another source and I write a subpoena to the service provider, then they send me something back saying, yeah, on this date and time, this address was using this IP. I can use that. So yes, we have to be very cautious. And I feel that we have to be even more cautious, because if I go up and accuse somebody of harming children and I'm wrong, the effects of that are devastating. Then I'm victimizing somebody else. So we have to be right. And in order for us to use OSINT, again, it's a gap filler, but if you're not skilled in this, and I push law enforcement heavily to go get involved in these Trace Labs events. This is where you're going to start developing your skills and honing your skills. And then when you get really comfortable, we're working with Trace Labs now on these Five Eyes events. We've got another one coming up probably in January. So we're gearing up for that one. But yeah, I think that's about all I can say on the OSINT side. There's a ton of information out there, but if somebody's reputation or well-being is on the line, you better be sure of what you're accusing them of, and you better be sure of the source, and you better have more than just that one point to back it up.
So, I mean, Linda, in our training, we typically try to push people to have a structured kind of methodology of how they're going to do some identity resolution and then verification, right? And then we try to look for 1 to 3, you may sometimes only have one artifact that ties a small piece of information to an online identity that is, where you're going to try to, serve a subpoena, and then that's going to turn up more information. But if you don't have that capability of law enforcement, we're always pushing people to have 2 or 3 or 4 other correlated type pieces of information. That could be aliases, email addresses, photos, locations, and then the same, 2 or 3 correlated pieces of information on different types of platforms, so eventually when you're looking at that kind of stuff on your link analysis graph, that could be Maltego or I2 or Palantir or whatever, you have these nodes, these central nodes that kind of start looking larger, and you can visualize that as I have a little bit more weight on this artifact and how it relates to other things. And then you can also kind of let that data tell the story, not try to fit a story, like not trying to do the opposite really, So a lot of folks, when they first start, they try to fit their artifacts into a story versus letting the artifacts tell the story, right? And that's always like, don't ever do that, like you're going to burn the trust with whoever you're presenting that to, as well as you're going to piss somebody off really bad that's on the other side of that,
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And as Kevin, sorry, someone, was that you?
No, I was just agreeing with him. It's
great. Yeah. And which is what I was actually going to refer to. What Kevin was saying was making sure that that information is accurate. You don't actually want to be accusing someone who is actually not the right person. So Dan, you've actually touched on what I wanted to chat with you about was in relation to what we're doing here with the National Missing Persons Hackathon, and what TraceLab are doing in relation to OSINT for Good. And looking at, there's a lot of things that we have done in relation to the hackathon to ensure integrity, to ensure privacy, to ensure security across the cases, the data that we use, how we hold it, to make sure that we are not, contravening any laws or regulations. So touching on that, what are some of the like rabbit holes or challenges that OSINTers can find through going too far and crossing those boundaries?
Well, I mean, so from my perspective, that boundary, and Liz, I think you'll probably agree with this, that boundary is usually when it comes into like computer exploitation or breaking into something that isn't deemed publicly accessible data, right? So there's all sorts of cool tips and tricks that you can get information without breaking the rules, but you just can't break into stuff to get that data and then try to introduce that as something as probable cause or something that's not publicly accessible. And the reason that we want to go for publicly accessible information most of the time, if you're going to be augmenting the law enforcement function or illegal cases, you need to give that package over to law enforcement, so then they can go replicate it. They're going to go do their due diligence on it, and then they can have probable cause as, you know, a secondary process outside of what you've already produced, because you might just be a crazy loon, right? So there's always that, you know, testing of the data by, you know, peer review and that kind of stuff before it gets to an actionable, you know, next step. And, you know, the main thing is, you know, don't try to be cool and break into something so you can, you know, have a trophy. That's not cool, you know, like go be slow and be okay with the boring details.
I'll add on that as well. It's not just, it's a really good point, Daniel. It's not just being cool, though, not to minimize what you're saying. I agree with it. But there's a lot of intelligence operations that do go on that you have zero insight into. And it's a really good way to screw somebody else's intelligence operation up, is by thinking that you're the only player on the internet. And so I've seen a lot of this over the years, not on the tracking of the individual so much, but definitely on the counterterrorism side, where there was even for a while a couple of folks that were telling people to go pretend to be, you know, jihadists and get on forums and try to like find out these people. And when we were working operations, you know, they would screw up more than their fair share of them. And it, you know, I would presume that there was, or I would casually present that there was real life consequences from people thinking they were good when they were actually just playing in a larger pool.
Yeah, and I mean, you see some of the folks in the malware scene, or, you know, kind of stepping over other people's investigations all the time, especially with the cyber command stuff a few weeks ago, which was totally retarded. It happens too often. People want to be famous, and it's sick, you know.
That's actually a really good example of Cyber Command and Microsoft's takedown TrickBot. That was, I don't know. I think a lot of people like came out and praised Cyber Command for that, and not to put them down too much. But you have Microsoft working with the Department of Justice over more than a decade doing takedowns of infrastructure and botnets and similar. They were actively working on the TrickBot one, working with the government in the US, DOJ, et cetera. And then Cyber Command comes out of nowhere and goes, "Yeah, we just took it down." Like, what are you doing? Like, you're
and it's not down. It wasn't.
Well,
it's not down.
And that's the challenge, is it's never really, you know, stuff like that. It's kind of like it'll always spring back up 5 different ways. But again, kind of, and part of that is my better half having worked in that. I've watched over the years, you know, the level of collaboration. And when you get into some of the botnets and some of the others, and trying to say, like, there may be a reason to leave this up to watch it. So trying to talk some of the companies I've worked with and researchers going, please don't sinkhole everything. You don't, you know, you don't know who is in collaboration. And it also goes to some of the research as well, as you hear like, oh, we found this vulnerability, we found, et cetera. Let's just immediately rush. And it's like, but do you know if the team's already working on it? Is there a fix for it? Is it like, have you asked these questions? Kind of, you can get your book deal later. Just take it down a notch. And we'll do that. As Kevin said, I mean, you have to protect, you know, there is a chain of custody. There is a chain, like there are certain things that to successfully prosecute that law enforcement does have to go to, and just be respectful that just because you don't see something that doesn't mean nothing's happening.
Right. And I would also add in there too, especially with some of the missing person cases and any of the, you know, exploited children type stuff, be prepared for, like, you don't want to be the hero, you know, be prepared to be humbled by like an extremely crazy action that may happen. I've seen, you know, guys that get rolled up on that I've helped build cases on, and their parent, you know, the family didn't know anything about what was going on, and the dad was definitely a pedophile and he shoots himself in front of his family. You know, like that happens a lot. You know, the missing children's cases, like from my experience, you know, nine out of 10 of them end up dead. You know, so like be very careful and how you're dealing with the information, and how you're also kind of protecting your heart during these investigations, because things can go sideways. And, you know, being a hero, we're all here to try to do a little bit better, but in this context, there's definitely some real responses that are going to come back, and you might be wrong or deadly right, you know.
And some of the things that we get in the exploitation field is that, you know, people think it's like the movie Taken. That's been all the thing is thrown out a lot, right? Kidnappings. And the reason that we only support law enforcement investigations, you know, we step in and we have we got a network of experts, investigators that overlap in various levels of expertise in the military. We got just a broad range, but I've seen the mistake made of people with OSINT skills or some level of tech skills assisting on finding a missing kid, only to find later that the person that had been abusing her was her father, and her father wanted her found. So keep that in mind, that, you know, in law enforcement, we can see a lot of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes through search warrant legal process. But in reality, we really don't know what these missing kids are running from, or in a lot of cases, what they're running to. You know, in a lot of ways, it's both, that they're running from something and they're running to something because they've been groomed. But yeah, excellent points here made by everybody.
Yes, and Kevin, you have a particular set of skills in response to Taken. And look, no, they are absolutely valid and great points. And it is probably one of the first set of questions we were actually asked when we partnered with Trace Labs and the AFP for the first time last year to develop the National Missing Persons Hackathon, was about what if they don't want to be found? What if, you know, they have actually created this themselves and not knowing the situation that they're coming from or where they are actually going to. A lot of those things obviously are possible, but we do work within a framework that are provided by the relevant policing jurisdictions. So we can safely say that those cases that are provided to us are those that police are obviously eager to find additional information on. If I can just touch back, sorry, on I think, Robert, it might have been something that you had mentioned in regards to collaboration between government and private enterprise. Is that something that is seen as the norm in the US? And I'll throw this out to everyone, that government is coming to private enterprise to say, hey, we need your help with this, or we want to work with you on this.
Yeah, on law enforcement, I think it is the norm, and you see a really good connective tissue between the private sector and law enforcement. On my world of industrial control systems and kind of non-law enforcement, usually, I would say that there is government collaboration, but not to be the super critic. I will say that, you know, there's a theme, and you're talking about the Australia versus US thing as well. There's a theme of a lot of the early investment in this community where there was either like the hacker groups or similar, or you had law enforcement and military and intelligence community people coming into the private sector. And so no country has a monopoly on innovation, but those countries that did invest heavily in their law enforcement intelligence agencies, like the Five Eye countries, did have a lot of that cybersecurity talent. So that was true. And so I will say, by the nature of government and other investment, the private sectors in these countries have gotten better. But today, the cybersecurity expertise is way more in the private sector than it is in the government. And so what I often will find is the government wants to get back involved in something, or they abdicated the responsibility before. We see this a lot in the US around, well, don't call us for an incident. You know, you got to handle it your own. You're on your own for these state attacks. And then all of a sudden DHS pops up and goes, well, I'm here now and you should call me. It's like, where have you been for the last decade? Like you're out, man. Like don't come in when we already have a market and a community and we're already working on this. It's just driving confusion. And you got to be careful in that in Australia, like your Australian national strategy that you published on cybersecurity. I wrote on that noting that the Australian government said, oh, well, we're going to be a resource to the private sector, and we're going to come out and help you defend your networks. So you're going to deploy government agents to defend networks. Like what type of movie are you watching?
Yeah. We're the government. We're here to help.
Exactly. And then you saw the investment. I think it was like $1 billion or $1.6 billion or something. And it's like, what, like, that's not even like the tip of an iceberg of what Silicon Valley is investing in this problem. And so it's interesting. And I guess I'll kind of just wrap it up in saying, should there be partnership? Yes. Like ASD, ACSC, they're doing great jobs. DHS does a lot of good work. But what is the role and responsibility? Who has what lane? Like that's got to be really clearly defined. And it's usually not even defined inside the government agencies, let alone between the private sector and the government. But I'm a staunch defender of the fact that tax-paying companies shouldn't be competing with tax-paid entities. It will destroy markets and community very quickly. So we definitely got to find the right balance. And I think Australia's got a little bit ways to go there. You got to be careful. I've gone into facilities where they said, oh, my response plan is to call the government, but the government doesn't actually have a response plan for that. And I would say the last thing I'll say on this, and I'll shut up, is on the investment side, on just Australia versus US. I've got an Australian team. I'm not going to take part in that. But what I will say is if you want to capitalize on what Australia does have, which is a lot of good cybersecurity expertise, there is a lot more investment needed. One of the reasons the US has and will continue to do well is venture capital, like it or not. The opportunities and the ecosystem available to companies and startups is much richer in the United States than it is in Australia right now. And that's something that needs shifted if you're going to want to see that innovation that you do have kind of scaled out.
Great points, Robert. If I can just point to my logo right here, if I'm pointing in the right section for AustCyber, which is actually part of our mission in relation to creating and growing a more vibrant cybersecurity ecosystem in Australia. And that is part of our remit in regards to growing, educating and exporting sovereign capabilities. So I think we might just perhaps take you as a quote and share that on social media. For us in support. But just more broadly to everyone else, I'd love to touch on everyone else's thoughts in regards to the innovation piece as to how you see that environment in the US, but through your experiences or through your ability to look across the world, how do you see the US and Australia fitting in with when it comes to innovation?
We've got some great stuff coming out of Australia when you look at the vulnerability disclosure programs that several of the companies and several of the industry voices who have been leading the charge are based there, and really watching. I'm excited to see, to the extent y'all did have the policy announcement and looking at the IoT standards and helping drive some of that as well. That it's great to see also government taking a national standard on some of that, because it's hard for companies to develop strategies to go into different states in the US, not knowing what necessarily the privacy protections, that what data that they may have. And of course, from the legal community, they would be very upset if I said, oh, let's have a national standard, because that makes it easier for companies, and that's going to put some lawyers out of work. But building that kind of thing, it really does help drive innovation, because it gives companies a framework to work within and say, okay, are we doing this? Well, this is what we need to do so we can focus on some other things.
And for me, the collaboration is it's what we've built on, is the collaboration between the private sector and law enforcement. And one of the reasons that I stayed where I'm at now is I have a lot of freedom. I'm a deputy prosecutor. As long as I keep up with my caseload and I don't embarrass my boss, I can do a lot of things. So I've managed to pull together a lot of people. We've been very successful. We're thinking differently, approaching things differently. I can come to some people on the tech side and discuss an issue and say, this is what I'm seeing. And they'll say, hey, what if you take that thing right there and ask this other company for this other thing over here? So, we're finding these connections that law enforcement, we're not engineers. We don't do this stuff. We need to collaborate. We need to have that interaction. Technology is moving forward so rapidly that we're not able to keep up. So this collaboration and this discussion is vital. And when I put this Five Eyes event together, with Trace Labs, and we kicked this thing off, we also went into the private sector and said, hey, we've got these investigators, we need some tools. And Daniel's one of them, the Shadow Dragon. He didn't hesitate. He said, here you go. So he equipped them. Yeah. Chris Poulter with OSINT combined. Next, he threw in his tools and his expertise and time. And there were a lot of people that came in, and it went really, really well. So that vital.
I think that was a great example too. It's like even 10 days before, like, what was it, like 2 weeks before the event, you had 10 kids already identified and yes, saved before the official event started, while we just had them going through our training classes. You know what I mean? Like, right. It was just plug and play. Hey, just, get the most amount of training and tools out to the most amount of people, and hey, tell me how good it goes. But you guys did a great job on, especially having Kevin Branzetti over there, Mr. Knowledge base of questions on how to serve subpoenas, man. That guy has the best knowledge base on the most obscure questions for every possible platform and interconnected data source ever.
Yeah,
Kevin's in the Manhattan PAs, so
yeah.
Look, and this is why we do this, and we're able to do it with the support of everyone here on the panel, and more broadly all the other companies, both private and public, who are actually able to support these sorts of missions, where we're actually supporting members of our community and vulnerable members of our community as well. So our extended thanks on that. Look, noting we have 3 minutes left, I'm going to throw one last question out to you, and it's for those, for our participants, for our students, those that are either studying in cybersecurity, or those that want to step into this career, whether it be cybersecurity, whether it be OSINT for good. Can I throw out to you, what is one piece of advice that you would give to them, either as a participant or as a student of cybersecurity wanting to enter this as a career? And just, I'll throw it out there.
Well, for mine, what I see a lot of is don't be afraid to be a beginner. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Just get in and learn. And also, I will point out the Five Eyes event, I did have investigators that were contacting us saying, hey, we're getting into this Tor, this dark net region that I'm really not comfortable with. I said, that's great. Get with somebody who is good. Argos they're brilliant. They're excellent at that. So get with one of those investigators, tag along, watch what happens, and see if you want to learn that. But recognizing your weaknesses, recognizing your limitations, and just being willing to learn.
Yeah, I would say try to play the long game. Like, have a goal, stick with it. Take the hardest possible classes that you possibly can, like, don't settle for like just a Java class. Go take CPU architecture stuff, like, be okay with being patient to get to your goal. And like, a lot of times I hear people are like, they get discouraged because they're like, oh, so-and-so, he learned this so fast. And, there's some guy who's like, yeah, I just read this book and now I'm the super expert in one night. And it's all BS, right? Like, they're just posing. Be okay with taking the time that you need to strive for excellence towards the goals that you have, and forget about the social life. Forget about going out on the weekends. Be okay with being a bookworm. Be okay with being a nerd, and invest in yourself. Like, I invested heavily in my teens and 20s, and it paid off great later on in life. And that was at a sacrifice of a lot of other things, but just play the long game and stick with it, and know that you're going to have payoff. Just strive for excellence.
And I think one of the things, even just building on, if you haven't gotten the message through Kevin's or Dan's, like ask the questions, but build that network. So don't be afraid to, and you don't have to have the answer. You just need to know who to call, who can point you in the right direction. So you don't want them to spoon feed you. You don't want them to give it to you, but tell me, like, hey, if I want to learn more about this, what book should I read? What podcast should I listen to? What courses, how do I do this? And a lot of the community is very happy to share those resources and share that knowledge, as long as you're respectful of their time and, that kind of thing. But even professionally, as you can see, everyone is willing to, like, hey, I'll share the information I have here. What can you do? And can we collaborate? That as students, it carries on through life, that you never stop learning, especially in this field.
Yeah, I threw some resources on the ICS side over in the chat. I have a blog that I wrote specifically on like getting started in ICS. But what the advice given by the panelists is perfect. So I'll be the saltier advice then, which I think is also needed, which is there's no limit to the amount of people that will come up and say, I want to get started. How do I get started? And it's like, what do you want to do? Or what would you like to go after? And nobody can solve that question for you. So pick something you would like to do, figure that piece out first. It doesn't have to be long-term, just even if it's a temporary skill to pivot to another skill, but pick something. And then you can ask, hey, I exhausted my resources, I exhausted my Google searching as an expert in the field. Where do you think I need to go next? But if it's, I like cybersecurity, I want to do cybersecurity, that's too broad to be real anymore. So pick something, and then any of us and anybody in the community can help you go to the next step after you kind of know where you want to start.
Fabulous words of advice from our panelists. So thank you very much for that. Look, time for us to head off quickly. Thank you so much, Liz, Kevin, Daniel, and Robert. Very, very much appreciate you taking the time out to have a chat with us. I'll now deem you as honorary Australians. We would love to host you next year at Cyber Week. So please keep in touch. We'd love to see you out here for 2021. And just a reminder to everyone, please, next week is Australian Cyber Week. Log on to oscyber.com. You will find yourself a microsite with all of our Cyber Week activities that cross over so many different elements. Please come and join us through our online virtual webinars, sessions, networking events, and most importantly for us, the National Missing Persons Hackathon for 2020. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, and look forward to engaging with you soon. Thank you.